The example I always give is the old experiment, I forget what it's called, where you put 20 people in a circle, you start with a story.
Telephone game.
Yeah, the telephone game. You whisper it in their ear and go down the lane, and it changed by 10% or something, or 20% by the end.
Bart Ehrman talks about this a lot. I do think that it's not wholly appropriate for something like the Gospels.
Alex O'Connor debunks a common misconception atheists likes to use to debunk the Bible, and it's absolutely amazing. So let's get right into it. Shout out to Julian Dory for his podcast, and Alex O'Connor, even though he doesn't believe in Jesus, debunking myths. Let's get into it.
One interesting question is, well, when are these manuscripts from? Are they from the 4th century? That's cool. But when were the texts written? That's the most interesting question. And, they weren't originally written in Coptic. What language were they written in, and when were they written?
It's also, this is another, sticking point for me with any of this. When we think of our current history, 10 years ago feels like a long time.
Yeah.
To an extent. And then you start looking 60, 70 years out. That's like when your great-grandparents were kids.
Yes.
When you start looking at history, the farther away it gets, though, time kind of has a wider lens, and at least in how we approach it, which means we hear years like, I'm going to throw out random numbers, 140 AD and 210 AD, and associate it with almost the same about time.
Yes.
But it's 70 years apart at a time where the record keeping was you wrote something in the sand.
Yeah. Not only that, but it's important to note, especially when we're talking about Gospels, that, for example, most scholars date the Gospel of Mark, which is our earliest canonical Gospel, to around 70 AD. And there are various reasons for doing that. Matthew and Luke...
but people have dated it earlier. You have to admit that.
Generally dated between maybe 90, between 75 to probably 85, that kind of decade, 10 or 15 years after Mark.
And they say Christ died in around 33
around 30,
AD.
33 AD, yeah. And so John's Gospel is then probably between 90 and 100 AD. Now, compare that to suppose the Gospel of Thomas. Suppose we just proved beyond reasonable doubt that it was dated to 150 AD. Right? And that's probably around about when it was written, sort of 2nd century. Some people think it was dated earlier, but that's controversial. Suppose it was 150 AD. You might think, okay, John's Gospel's written in 90 AD.
It's not that controversial. It could be written a lot earlier.
And the Gospel of Thomas is written in 150 AD. So roughly about the same time, right? So no big difference between them. But in this context, that could be the difference between an eyewitness to the events of Jesus' life still being alive and still being dead.
Yes.
If Mark 100%. Is written in 70 AD, that's still 40 years after Jesus dies.
Yep.
But 40 years is a short enough time that people could still be alive. It could have been written by an eyewitness. It could have been written by someone who knew an eyewitness. That extra few decades is the difference between eyewitness testimony being possible and being impossible. So it does actually make a huge difference.
Even on that thread, though, eyewitness testimony itself also changes naturally without people trying to lie or stuff. You remember details in a small way. The example I always give is the old experiment, I forget what it's called, where you put 20 people in a circle, you start with a story.
Telephone game.
Yeah, the telephone game. You whisper it in their ear and go down the lane, and it changed by 10% or something, or 20% by the end, through no fault of people other than just human error. And it's it's not to sit here and be a total skeptic about everything, but it's when you take something as law or canonical law, whatever you want to say, that's this is what happened 100%, we have the proof. It's all right, you are relying on I'm even talking about the ones where you still have an eyewitness testimony person alive, right? Mm-hmm. Forget the other ones you point out where you don't. Yeah. You are relying on the word of flawed human beings, which we all are.
Yeah. I think that's a really bad argument for that time, because 90% of the people were illiterate, and they really relied on memorization and oral traditions. It wasn't that big of a deal, and it was more important that they would collaborate and figure out what story was the truth and what wasn't. And to Alex O'Connor's credit here, he backs this up and saying, that's actually not a very good argument. which is amazing for Alex O'Connor to say that. To assume that everything that was said is how it is. And we even see that some of these people are coming up with different versions of the same thing who lived at the same time. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a common analogy that's given is the telephone game. Bart Ehrman talks about this a lot. I do think that it's not
wholly appropriate for something like the Gospels, because the point of the telephone game is you only get to hear it once. And the fun is that you then have to hope you hear it right and pass it on. And you're kind of trying to make it go wrong because that's why it's funny. With important traditions, you pass it on and you check you've got it right. So you're going to tell me something, I'm going to repeat it back to you. You're going to correct any misunderstandings. I'm going to make sure I have it memorized, and then I'm going to pass it on to my children, for example. And so the oral transmission of religious traditions, I think, is a lot more reliable than people often realize, because, like you say, this was the only way that information is transpired.
Let's go.
Imagine if you're learning something important, you're learning about your family history, or you're learning something for class or whatever, and you're not allowed to write it down.
Yeah.
And it's not written in a book anywhere else. You would probably put a lot more effort into remembering exactly what was said.
That's true.
And so that's passed down a lot better. But I am suspicious, for example, when people say we have so much of Christology, which is the study of the nature of Jesus, relies on his exact words. Like it says in the Gospels that Jesus used this phrase, and this is really important. Why did he say that instead of this? When it gets that specific, I get highly suspicious, right? You're listening to me very carefully right now, right? You're paying attention to the words I'm saying?
Of course.
Okay, excluding the sentence I just said. Can you repeat my previous sentence to me?
Word for word? No.
No. Can't even come close. You probably couldn't even really paraphrase it very well. But you're paying
Because
attention quite well.
I am transcripting the information you have and translating it into understanding what you're saying versus the exact words and lingo and prepositional phrases you're using to land it there.
Exactly. And so you can't remember the words that I spoke 20 seconds ago. And I'm expected to believe that the gospel authors, who were writing at best decades after the death of Jesus, remembered the exact words that he'd spoken. I'm not convinced of that.
Well, there are certain things when you sit back, you remember, like you go away from the conversation, there's certain things that you do remember very well. Like I think they get into this, but Jesus ever said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." That's going to shock people. When he said, "I am," just like God told Moses, "I am." That's going to shock people. You're going to remember those phrases.
There's an idea that people had been traditionally like remembering the words that he'd said and passing them on to each other and sharing them and authenticating them against different independent traditions, and that can be true. But when it's as important as in this particular instance, did Jesus call himself the Son of Man or a Son of Man? And that actually makes a big difference.
Yes.
Then I think we need to be a lot more suspicious.
To play devil's advocate on some of that, though, in our own lives, forget even something as serious as like Jesus or a historical figure. In our own lives, you may listen to someone talking with you for an hour, right?
Yes.
And you're talking about something serious with them. And to your point, I can't remember what they said 30 seconds ago in the exact words, but at some point, you know, the drama of the situation lines up that they land the plane and they say something that isn't, those words are ingrained in your head forever.
Yes.
So there could be some of that.
And that's what probably happens in a lot of these cases with Jesus. So really, really big Christological moments. In John's Gospel, Jesus appears in chapter 8 to like invoke the divine name. He says to his Jewish opponents, "Before Abraham was, I am."
Yep.
And I am, ego eimi in Greek, is thought by many to be a callback to the name that God gives Moses as his own name, Eesha in the Hebrew, which kind of means ego eimi, which is what Jesus says. And so if Jesus really did say something like that, it is the kind of thing that would stick in the mind.
Yes.
The mystery then is why only John's Gospel reports it, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke have no mention of such an event. So there are other reasons to suspect the historicity of that event. But a lot of like reading into the words of Jesus isn't just the big headline obvious stuff like that. It's more specific stuff, like the Son of Man stuff. Jesus uses the title Son of Man for himself all the time. It's like he uses it more than any other title for himself, I think. And it's a bit of a mystery what it means, because Son of Man in Aramaic, which is the language Jesus spoke, is just a sort of slang term that means human being. Bar Nash, it just means human being. So you would say that person is a son of man. It just means that they're a human being. You know, they were born of a human being. But weirdly, the Greek New Testament consistently has Jesus use the definitive article, the Son of Man, which is a really clunky Greek phrase. It's not something that just...
It's because in Daniel, they talk about the Son of Man riding on chariot of horses and fire and everything else. Like, there's a difference. There's a clear distinction here. Why is that bad? I don't think that's something that they would be like, oop, I accidentally said a son of man instead of the son of man. That's not going to be coming up. Those are clear distinctions. I highly doubt they're going to be like, oh, well, maybe it was a son of man. It's not like the English word where, it would be easier to slip up, in my opinion.
It's lost in translation. It was very particular. It was done on purpose. It's not a son of man. It's the son of man.
Yes.
So we've got this title, the Son of Man, which we associate with Jesus. But a lot of scholars think that the way we should sort of think about this is as if, because Son of Man just means human being, it's as if someone was going around calling himself the human being or the one in like the Matrix sense.
Yeah.
Which until something like the Matrix popularizes that usage would be really clunky and strange. But it seems like Jesus might have been doing something like that. Like, I am the human one, It's extremely strange. But if there were some instances where he was actually just saying, I am a human, it would totally change the interpretation of a verse. So, for example, have you ever heard the phrase, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath? You ever heard this before?
I don't think so. No.
So the Sabbath is supposed to be a day of rest, right? It's the seventh day of the week. And in Jewish law, you have to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. Jesus is working on the Sabbath. His Jewish opponents come up to him and say, you're working on the Sabbath, because they're trying to catch him out. They don't like him. They want to eventually crucify him. So they say, you're working on the Sabbath. And Jesus goes, have you not read what David did? And he says that King David does the same thing. He sort of works on the Sabbath when he has to. And then he says that that the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So in other words, the reason that the Sabbath exists is for humankind's sake. It's so that we get our day of rest.
Yes.
Right. I mean, the Ten Commandments are not something just so you can't have fun or you can't flourish or you can't enjoy life. It's for your own benefit. Yes, it's a commandment, but it's for your own benefit. Your life will be 10 times better when you follow those commandments. Your life will flourish.
And so the criticism he's making of the Jews there is that they've become too legalistic. They sort of forgot the whole reason why the Sabbath exists in the first place. It's not just there because God hates it when you work on the Sabbath. It's there for your sake. The Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Jesus then says, therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Meaning he gets to decide what happens that day.
Well, that's the thing, right? Who is the Lord of the Sabbath? The Lord of the Sabbath is God. God is the one who...
I thought it was Ozzy Osbourne.
God is the one who institutes this. yeah, he's the other Son of Man.
Fuck.
In the Gnostic Gospels, they associate Ozzy Osbourne. The person who institutes the law about the Sabbath in the Ten Commandments is God. So God is the Lord of the Sabbath. But here's Jesus saying, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Me, the title I'm using, the Son of Man, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. So he's claiming to be God. Unless... this is a tradition that's been lost in translation, and Jesus actually said, Son of Man, just to mean human beings.
Over and over again?
But you're speculating, saying, oh, this could have been lost in translation. Do you have any proof for that? That's what seems to be a little bit of a stretch here, Alex.
Well, some scholars like Morris Casey think that that's what's happened. I think that's dubious. I think that
seems like a stretch.
The use of the definitive article is too strong to think that Jesus wasn't sometimes using it essentially as a kind of title. But this instance, for example, check it out, right? So he says, can you go to the version in Mark's Gospel? Can you type in Mark, Lord of the Sabbath? Yeah. Mark is our earliest Gospel.
We also, by the way, I haven't been saying this whole time, but a whole nother rabbit hole here is the translation.
Yeah, that's
of all these gospels.
So much of that is
where one article can be here instead of there.
I've got something for you on that. So
does it start with Amen?
Go back and go to the actual. Just type in Mark 2 into that where it says there. Just type Mark 2, and hit enter. Okay, and then scroll down until you keep scrolling. Jesus, Lord of the Sabbath. So he said, right. So they come up to him, the Pharisees say, look, what he's doing is unlawful on the Sabbath. Jesus answers, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? So they enter into the temple and eat the bread that only the high priest is supposed to eat. So first thing to notice is Jesus is justifying his breaking of the Sabbath by pointing to another human being and saying, well, he did the same thing. He then says, then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So, and the word does mean therefore, the word so there, it does actually mean therefore in the Greek. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So a traditional Christian interpretation of this is Jesus is claiming to be God because he claims to be the Lord of the Sabbath, which is only God. But if this has been lost in translation, which I suspect of this verse, and Jesus in this instance meant Son of Man in the Aramaic colloquial sense of just meaning a human being, all he's saying is that human beings are Lord of the Sabbath. In other words, humans are Lord of the Sabbath. Sabbath isn't Lord of human beings. Which, hold on a second, is exactly what he's just said in other words. So my interpretation here, that Jesus is just saying that the Son of Man, what he actually said was like, Son of Man as in human beings.
Yes.
Now reread the verse with that interpretation in mind. They accuse him of breaking the Sabbath. He says, well, David did the same thing. And then he says, look, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, human beings are Lord of the Sabbath. Because he's just said that the Sabbath was made for mankind.
Is he essentially saying that, like, instead of trying to treat this like a law that you're dictating your whole life around to feel like you're doing the right thing, it's really supposed to be a guideline as a method to how to live your life in a good way?
In this instance, I don't know if I'd phrase it in those terms, that it's just like
It's
a
polite
guideline.
way of saying fuck no.
No, because I think you're probably about right, but I think saying guidelines is too loose. Like it's not like, well, these are rules, but they're only guidelines, so break them if you want to. It's more like understand what the purpose of the law is. The law is there for your sake. You know. But what I'm trying to bring out with this particular verse is that I think that is the interpretation of what's actually happening here. But the specific words here, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, it's a little bit weird and clunky because he's just said that David broke the Sabbath and that was fine. He's just said that the Sabbath was made for mankind and then suddenly shifts to talking about himself, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.
Because he's not mankind.
Why has he just spoken about David breaking the Sabbath? Why has he just said that the Sabbath was made for mankind? And then suddenly he's talking about himself. Doesn't it make more sense if he would say, well, David broke the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was made for mankind, therefore mankind is Lord of the Sabbath?
I see what you're saying.
Therefore, I think when he says here, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, I think it's probably not a mistranslation from the Greek, but the Greek itself is probably a misreporting of what actually happened here.
Yeah, I don't know. But one thing is, that's why we don't worship on Saturday. We worship on Sunday, mostly because Jesus resurrected from the dead on Sunday, and that's a celebration. But yeah, we do need a day of rest. There are so many studies when you try to work 7 days in a row that your body will literally fall apart. It will be so exhausted where things won't run as they should. So we do need rest. In God's ways is always right. Praying for Alex and Connor and Julie and Dory that they really come to know Jesus and put their faith and trust in Jesus more than their own knowledge, more than the things that they think is right or do. So I thought that was interesting. I'd love to know the comments. I would love to know what your thoughts are on this. That would be super interesting. So I encourage you guys to do that. If you've never decided to follow Jesus, I encourage you to do that today. In the description below, you will be able to click a link to help you to decide to follow Jesus for the first time. So do that today.